This presentation is going to focus on special needs education. It's going to focus on special needs education and how it relates to alternative education and alternative schools. If you ask most people, the greatest aspect of the United States is equality. This is a country where everyone is supposed to have an equal chance at opportunity. But not everyone is born equal. Some people are born into privilege and have a much easier time of it. Other people are born or come into the fact that they have special needs. As educators, we are the ones who are supposed to level the playing field. Education is the great equalizer in our country. And how do we do that with our special needs students? Well, first of all, what are special needs students? Well, special needs students cover a wide range of different diagnoses. Some have learning disabilities. I'm going to focus mostly in this talk with people that don't have what are kind of considered minor special needs. And by that, it means that they don't suffer from any major health disorders or any major cognitive disabilities. These are people who are just as smart as anyone else, but they have some impairments and have some things that kind of make things a little bit different for them. They can't do things in the traditional way as easily as other people. Well, with learning disabilities, the biggest one, and people have heard about this very often, is ADD, ADHD. But there are other learning disabilities as well. There's some emotional difficulties sometimes. There are, problems with dyslexia and those types of things. Cognitive impairments, those can range from very serious impairments to minor impairments. And again, you might be talking about stuff like dyslexia and those sorts of things. Physical impairments, there are a lot of people who have the skills to do great in school, but they might be bound to wheelchairs, or they could have major physical problems. And I'm not really going to be dealing with those kind of issues in this, but mostly with people with physical impairments that would still, make them be able to fit right into a classroom. Other people have mental illnesses. Things such as depression are very common. There are chronic illnesses, people with asthma and that sort of thing, and then people with behavioral challenges. Emotional disorders are very common among the students that we have in our classes. But a lot of people with these different diagnoses still have just as much cognitive abilities as other people, and the other students that they're going to school with, but they just may need a little bit different kind of education, a little bit different than the traditional setup for education. Okay. So some statistics dealing with special needs students. About 13, this is according to the National Center for Education Statistics. According to them, in 2012, about 13% of all students were considered special needs students in the United States. Okay. Of those, 35% had learning disabilities. By learning disabilities, again, we were talking about ADD, we're talking about dyslexia. Those are certainly the most common of the learning disabilities. And things along that order. Many people have those. You wouldn't know that, unless they were told or found out from a special education teacher, or otherwise, people wouldn't know. 21% have language impairments. Now, those will include some things such as stuttering, voice control, monotone. There are different ailments that people have. But far and away, the greatest aspect of language impairments is simply that English is not their first language, and being in a school in the United States makes it a more difficult time for them to learn, a more difficult place for them to learn. And oftentimes, students, ESL and ELL students, will end up in special needs education. 12% are also have stuff with health impairments. For the most part, those include things like asthma and that sort of thing. These are things that can get in the way of their education and have to be taken care of, and there have to be different provisions for them, but they have all the cognitive abilities to do just as well in school as anyone else. Okay? These represent, almost approximately 2/3 of all of special needs students fall in this category. And some of these will certainly have, some people will have language impairments or health impairments or learning disabilities that are major problems, and they are going to need a much more one-to-one intensive base of education in order to succeed. But a great majority of these students do not. And they can be included in the system, and they can work in the system and do just as well as anyone else. And long as they get their needs met. So these represent the minor end of the spectrum. And by minor, that means these are students who have all the cognitive abilities that any other student has. Okay. How do traditional high schools meet special education needs? Well, there's a lot of things being done in high schools to try and help with it. Inclusion is the first thing I put up there. I put a question mark with it because attempts at inclusion don't necessarily mean inclusion, but it is generally agreed upon, despite some of the difficulties with inclusion, that the idea of including all special needs students in as many or every way possible with a traditional high school curriculum and atmosphere is the best way to go about it. There's almost, there's a very strong consensus among traditional and alternative schools that seems to be the best way to go about it. Now, how we go about doing that, there are questions about that. Another way traditional high schools try to meet special education needs are 504 accommodations. If someone is, considered a 504 student, they get different accommodations. I had a student this last semester, she had vision problems, and one accommodation that was made for her was to give her a large magnifying glass, and that allowed her to read everything, much more easily. That would be an example of that. Team teaching is another way to work with special needs students. I worked in a class many years ago. No one in the class knew who was a special needs student in there, when about half the students were. I did have a special education teacher who several of the students that were in his caseload were in my class. We taught the class together, and I felt that was a very good approach. The students felt very included, unless they made some comment about it themselves. They did not seem to be, isolated as special education students, and I thought that in my experience, worked very well. There are other support services that are, are in schools. A lot of times, team teaching is one of those, or a teacher that will come in and help during lessons, or sometimes pull a student out of a class to work specifically on something they're struggling with. Again, when that happens, that can tend to lead to isolation for a student. But there are other services and materials such as the large magnifying glass for the students. Those kinds of things are there for students often in schools, depending on how well they can support these. Two other things that are really kind of the same are school within a school. You might have heard of SWS programs, or self-contained classes. Those generally are alternative schools inside of a regular traditional high school. Again, there's a lot of debate about the worth of these. There tends to be some questions among them, and I'll be getting to that in a little bit. But they do tend to be a way to try and identify special needs students within a traditional high school and try and supply the needs that they need. The issues with special education and the different options that we just saw. Inclusion. Is it actually inclusive? When students are included in a traditional classroom, it depends on how that is done. Again, I told you about one of my experiences with a team teacher where the special education students were not identified, and I felt that the students were very well included in that class. But many times this isn't the case. Special needs students will sometimes have different homework, different assignments. They will be pulled out of classes by special needs teachers.